Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Today, we get part 2 of an incredible series with the Executive Director of PREBORN, Roxy Lamorgese. PREBORN is the largest life-affirming organization in the world. They are literally saving lives now and for eternity, and they're breaking generational strongholds with the compassion and kindness of Jesus. The fight for life has just begun. Here we go. Hey, you want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, I want to talk a little bit about post Roe versus Wade America, right? But before I do that, I want to talk about the requirements that you have for the clinics. This really struck me. So I was doing some of my pre-show prep, and what I found was this: the clinics have to meet a certain number of requirements in order to be considered a strategic partner with PREBORN. And in the first one, there's two in particular I want to talk about. Number one, you talk about pregnancy clinics serving major metropolitan areas where abortion clinics are well established. Tell me about that. I mean, this is fascinating. And then you have another target area. Tell me about this target area, why this is so important.
Yeah, so historically, abortion, and it would probably still be true in some cases. So up to the most recent years, 58% of abortion actually only happened in 7 battleground states. That would be like California, specifically in SoCal, New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. area, Florida, Texas, New Jersey, and Illinois. 58% of abortion. It's crazy, right? 7 states. So when we say, we have to prioritize, but God calls us to wisdom. We have to prioritize our resources and where we make most of our impact. 58% of abortion happens on those states. By volume, it's just large cities, metro areas. Wow. So like California in itself has the largest volume of abortion. SoCal at some point has an average of reported, I don't know what's, just they don't report right? Wow. 110 to 130,000 abortions in a year. There's an area in New York City where PREBORN helped stand up a clinic from scratch, right? Where they actually would abort more baby than they would have live births. They had 33,000 recorded live births at some point and 39,000 abortion near the Brooklyn borough area. So that's where we want to be.
Yeah, that is tragic. I never knew that. I never knew that the majority of abortions were in 7 key areas around the country. It's fascinating. I'm guessing that's probably changing a little bit now because of Roe v. Wade. But, part of this too, and I know enough about the roots of Margaret Sanger. I know Planned Parenthood. I know the purpose, the original purposes of Planned Parenthood and abortion. And we talked about this being targeted racism in some ways, that a huge percentage of abortions are in minority communities. Does that still hold true?
It does. It does. Now, they don't want to talk about it, but it does. When you actually look at the city, the area that I told you about where they have more abortion than they do live births, you can simply study their demographics. If you go to California, South Central, those areas, you can actually study it. It doesn't take a lot. You can just Google half this stuff.
Right. It bothers me too, because in the earliest days, of course, the Planned Parenthood strategy was to win over the Black church. They knew that if the Black church spoke out against abortion, that their plan for eugenics, or, this isn't even controversial. This is fact. But they went to the Black churches to say, if you will, if you don't speak for what we're doing, don't speak against abortion, at the very least remain neutral, then this is a good thing for you. And they did it. They did it largely. The Black church complied with this idea of, hey, we're not going to speak out against it. I think that's changing. It feels like that's changing today because of the advent of the ultrasound and what we now know about what that life really is. Do you see that changing at all?
I think there's really now more opportunity for education. I think people's eyes. I think what happened when Roe fell is that it ripped the veil of the issue, right? Yes. Now it's front and center, and now we all have to confront what really is happening. And it's become this searing, dividing
Yes.
sore that fell into the church. And I just don't think it's only black church. I think it's a
Yeah.
lot of the church.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
lot of the church. Like I've been
Yes.
everywhere. I've
Mm.
literally been in churches that told me I cannot put you on the pulpit to talk about it. It's too political. I'm like, I'm confused. Or
Yes.
this is the most heartbreaking thing.
Yes.
I've been on a phone call with a church that told me we can't partner or support you anymore because we no longer believe the same things as you do. I'm like, I am now very confused.
Yes.
Like, what do you
Yes.
believe and what Bible are you
Yeah.
reading? Because we
Right.
must be reading a different
Right.
Bible,
It's
not the
absolutely
Bible of God.
right. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, and I was referring more to the original days of Planned Parenthood when they
Yes.
knew they needed to establish a movement. But today, the church, and we'll talk about this because the church, I believe, is the only hope of restoring a biblical culture in America. I mean, we have where else is this going to happen? But you had a second target, and this is fascinating to me. You had a second target area that is clinics near four-year universities and military bases. Okay, so this is concerning. Tell me about that.
Well, abortion is just like prevalent in those areas,
Mm,
and that's just fact. It's a
wow.
hard fact, but it's genuinely true. Um,
Mm,
Campuses. If you look at and honestly, so we do a lot of targeting and will hotspot and do studies,
mm,
demographics, abortion searches
mm,
where people looking for abortion. And I kid
mm.
you not, there's areas, there's even here's the sad truth, because we're going to talk about the church.
Yeah,
There's Christian colleges who would light up red with young kids looking for abortion. Christian
unbelievable.
colleges. I know this firsthand because I did a study with a team myself. Like, where do we go?
Wow.
Where do we find people? And like, there's colleges in California,
Yeah.
Christian colleges. There's a hub there. There's an like Northeast, um,
Wow.
and it's red. It's all red.
It's so sad, and I think you understand it, right? Because the church doesn't talk about it. There is shame, guilt, and shame associated with it. There's this sense that I think in the Christian world that you have to be perfect, and if you make that mistake, boy, you just want to get rid of that mistake. You don't want to.
Yeah.
It takes courage to admit to one mistake that led to maybe another mistake. It makes sense to me in some ways, but I think this is why education is so important. I mean, if we could talk about showing what actually happens during a pregnancy through ultrasound, for example, in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, and you see it, we would completely change the narrative, wouldn't we?
That's where really, they rule. We talk about the seven mountains of influence, right? They have
Yeah,
infiltrated a lot
everything.
of that. And really, the church should do that. We should not be
Yeah,
afraid to be in spaces where we're really called to be the voice of reason and the voice of
yeah,
truth. And instead of really, I don't mean this attacking in a negative way, but
yeah,
instead of really confronting
yeah,
the state
yeah.
of this nation, the church has somehow cowered and shrunk back. But that shouldn't be the case, right? We should
Right.
be the one who is bold and
Mm,
really speaking of truth.
yes.
And don't even talk about like the family units, like it starts at home. Um,
Right.
so man,
I know.
it's everywhere,
It
right?
is.
So
It is everywhere.
so
It is everywhere.
the church of Jesus Christ, like the remnant church of God,
Yes.
I think there's a remnant church and there's probably some that are playing church. And I think we're
Yeah.
getting to a point where we're seeing the difference, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it starts at home because no matter how much you educate the kids outside, but if your
Mm,
home life is solid, it's
yeah.
rooted in biblical foundations,
That's right.
right? From a
That's right.
healthy church,
Yeah.
things would still be different.
Yeah. That's right. And I think you're onto something. I mean, I think I've seen Eric Metaxas's new movie, The Letter to the American Church, and his book was fantastic. But he compares the complacency and the complicit nature of our church today as the way the church was in Nazi Germany. That we're standing on the sidelines, we're not sharing biblical truth when the culture is collapsing all around us. And I feel like that's this. Roe
Yeah.
versus Wade falls. The Supreme Court, it is a miracle of sorts, but we didn't see mass celebration of the religious community across the country. In fact, most pastors were silent didn't even talk about it in the pulpit.
Yeah.
What is happening?
I think they're afraid to talk about
Mm,
it. I think they're
mm,
afraid to talk about it. I
interesting.
Maybe they're afraid because they really don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how
Mm,
to strike the balance of truth without condemnation. But you can
right.
do both, right? Because the reality is, it's truth that sets those women free. It's kindness that
Yes.
leads them to repentance. And I
Yes.
believe that there's a way by which we could reach those women. And if we address it, we have to accept the fact that abortion happens 40% to professing Christians or people of
Wow.
faith. It happens 1 of 4 believers. So if they really look at their congregation, the likelihood is a quarter of those women sitting there has had an abortion, have walked through it. But instead of talking about it, we don't. We
Mm,
don't. Instead
yeah.
of like finding ways, seeking the Lord for wisdom to bring healing, to bring truth, we just like shove it all together. But
Yes.
you talked about the Nazi, right? There's actually a video that came out, and the last thing was, we can no longer be a church that just sings a little louder. We just
Mm,
sing within our 4 walls and call that church. Meanwhile, everybody's getting slaughtered outside
right.
the walls, and that's just not where we are right now in
Yeah.
this nation anymore.
Yeah. Do you have resources for pastors? So I'm just thinking right now, first of all,
Yes.
you should write a 30-minute sermon that can be plug and play for every single pastor that strikes this balance of repentance comes from kindness. Kindness leads to repentance. This idea of truth and grace and compassion all wrapped into one. Do we have those kind of resources?
Yes, they could email info@preborn.com and we
Perfect.
could get them plugged in.
Fantastic, because this is a message that should be in every pulpit, right? This is a moral issue. It's not a political issue, it's a moral issue. Okay. So, post Roe versus Wade, we talked a little bit about this, pre-show. How has the fight to protect unborn babies gotten easier or harder? Has it changed? What are we talking about now?
It has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And it has gotten harder at the
Mm,
field because the dynamics have changed. You have states that are restricting abortion, right? And you have states that
yeah.
are enshrining it in their law. So,
Yes. Yes.
like, there's just no telling what's happening. It's like a checkerboard, back to a checkerboard nation. And so
Yes.
you have states that are restricting your problems are different. You have people that are actually leaving out of state, and you've got to find them prior to them leaving out of state, reach them, and just make an appeal prior to.
Wow.
Because most of them actually know they can't have an abortion, so they flock. Now you have something called as abortion trafficking, abortion tourism, people leaving their states to have an abortion. There's actually grants available for women. Hey, we'll underwrite your thing, go to abortion and have a vacation. Like an abortion vacation. I mean, like, what is happening, right? And then you have states that are just not restricted, that you would perform abortion until up to almost birth, like third trimester
Mhm.
abortion, that are now really needing brick and mortar. So on
Yeah.
one side, you have to really be creative about outreach. On the other side, you really have
Mhm.
to be creative about strategic positioning. Like
Wow.
Preborn just opened a clinic 20 minutes away from LAX airport, right?
Wow.
8 minutes from one of the busiest Planned Parenthood in South Central. So just beginning to think
Amazing.
strategically of not only what is happening, but then how do you
Mm.
respond to what's happening to
Yes.
continue to make the impact that we really want to see in the
Yes.
movement of life.
Wow, it is a totally different deal, right? I mean, all of a sudden, it's not just a local issue. Now you have to reach people digitally. We will talk a little bit about that because I know that's part of your strategy. You talked about states, and this is really concerning, right? I live in a state that is California-like in its approach to life, doesn't value life at all. I live in Colorado. We've passed some of the worst pro-death legislation in the history of Earth. It's disturbing. Um, there are many states like us, right, that have passed this
Yeah.
horrific abortion on demand all the way through delivery. There were pieces of this legislation that said that parents could choose whether they wanted to give that baby care to live after they were born. It's that bad. And they passed this garbage legislation. There are also the states on the other side that are saying, hey, we're going to restrict it to even a heartbeat bill or whatever. So now we've got this. I've seen the maps on your website.
Yeah.
that show the states. It's horrible, right? It's like this patchwork.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is what you alluded to. People are leaving restrictive states to go to, open states. And is what we've done just kind of made it maybe harder for people to get to do what they want to do, or is it helping to reduce the number of babies that are terminated?
If I'm going to honestly answer this, I think if you look at the numbers, there has to be more that we need to look at. Like, I
Mm,
know there have been reports and the number of total abortions has seemingly decreased
mm,
in states that report. But I
yeah.
think we also have to look at what happened to the states next
Hmm.
to Texas.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
happened to the abortion rates of those states surrounding it? So there's really a lot of study
Mm,
that we really need to be wise so that we don't get lulled into complacency, thinking that this battle is won because Roe fell, because that's just far from truth. You have
mm,
women that are now getting abortion pills from the black market. You have women that are
right.
crossing the border. You have women that are leaving their states. You have reporting that are no longer accurate. And it's just at a ground level, when you look at where the women, when you pull everything aside and just focus on
Mm,
who's the real victim here, when you look at the woman,
yeah.
it's a mess.
Yeah.
And
What
you
a
have women
mess.
that are having abortion. They don't really have education. Now they're taking pills that they don't even know that work. And now they're making phone calls because they don't know if their abortion worked. You have women walking in clinics, bringing in baby parts. What do I do with this? Now you're talking about trauma upon trauma. You have young ladies ordering abortion pills that, man, then they'll have abortions in your home's bathroom. So
Yeah.
there's just so many things that are
Gosh.
happening that people would really not want to talk about, and the way that it
Right.
genuinely hurts women, right? I mean, how
Yeah.
traumatic is it to actually
Yeah.
like see baby parts and
Oh my
like figure
gosh.
out what do I do with this?
Yeah.
And
I
then they
can't
don't
even
answer
imagine.
now the call, right?
Right. Right. I can't even imagine. I mean, just in some ways, this has made a much worse scenario to save babies. It's much harder for sure, much harder to get the message to young ladies. I know that you mentioned this idea of destination abortions, like vacation abortions.
Yeah.
And we have some states that are paying for it, saying, hey, we're going to pay for you to come. So you can come from anywhere around the country. You don't have to tell your parents, which, of course, that's all being challenged, right? Because now you've got these interstate laws that are coming into play. But we also have companies that are paying for women to go to states to have abortions. What the heck is going on? Number one, what does a company have to do with it? But number two, why are they doing this? It can't be because they care about women, is it?
Well, I think they care about their bottom line. I think it's cheaper to send a woman out of
Yeah,
state, take care of business, than provide maternity leave.
right. And then potentially healthcare for that baby
Yeah.
ongoing, right? I mean, you've got a
Yeah.
lot of issues. It's got to be much more expensive to carry a baby to term, to have to
Delivery,
deliver that
insurance.
baby, right? Insurance and take care of that. It's got to be much more expensive. So how do we get that message to young ladies or to women that, your company, you think they're looking out for you, but they're actually not. It's a selfish play. It's much less expensive for them to transport you somewhere else to have an abortion and end that. It's how do we get that message to women?
It all boils down to when you have that opportunity to be in front of women.
Yeah.
And everything is really what we tell, and people need to understand this.
Mm,
We take a holistic approach to taking care
yes.
of women, meaning mind, body, soul. We talk about your mental
Mm,
health, your social well-being, your financial. What are your stresses? Why are you doing this? What are your resources?
amazing.
And we just take a full picture
It's
at her
amazing.
circumstance.
Mm,
And we try our
yeah.
best to do that to every woman that comes in the door, to make sure that we address those things. And it's on those
Yeah.
individual interactions. So think about it like
It's
every
amazing.
woman being a nurse, like we treat
Mm,
strokes different for every person. It's the same with an
mm,
abortion minded woman. There would be some commonalities and you'll find
mm,
that there's patterns, but at the
yeah.
end of the day, it's a one on one, case to case basis and taking every opportunity to educate her on her decision, really
Amazing.
educate her, really telling her why things are the way they are.
That's good. Uh, let's talk a little bit about the federal government. Okay. So this administration is actively targeting peaceful protesters, and they're prosecuting them. We see it over and over again. In fact, we've seen the Catholic Church targeted as an extremist group because of their views on life primarily. But the federal government is actively targeting peaceful protesters. They're actively prosecuting them. In fact, not too long ago, 6 pro-life advocates were convicted for peaceful protest. Talk a little bit about the, kind of the government climate, the legislative, not the legislative so much, but this prosecutorial climate that we're facing right now to target people for the freedom of access to clinic entrances legislation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that has really added a kind of layer of excitement to the work that we do, right? I mean, like, okay, this has gotten so much more exciting,
Yeah. I love
and
your attitude.
challenging.
I love your perspective about this, right? Because some might say, boy, this is really bad, but you're like, bring it on. Let's go. It makes it more exciting.
It does make it more exciting and challenging. It makes my prayer life really, really much more stronger, right? But
Yes.
you know what? At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. We are called to do
Mm.
the exact same thing.
Yes.
Whatever they do, they do. I think
Mm.
part of it is operating in wisdom, operating in
Yeah.
excellence, and really, when we say, I'm going to deliver healthcare, then deliver the right type of healthcare, because the reality is they're
Mm.
not, right? They're not
Yeah.
delivering true healthcare. It all boils down to taking care of the women the right way. And
Yes.
so that when people come looking, like when they say Daniel thrived in Babylon, that when the enemy tried to come, he findeth nothing. It boils
Yes.
down to operating well, best
Mm.
practices, and observing those things so that you could serve the women with confidence, right? I'm not
Mm.
doing anything wrong. I'm
Yeah.
educating the woman. I'm giving
Yeah.
her options. And then having the confidence and the boldness, like, I'm not doing anything wrong. If you come
Yeah.
find, you're not going to find anything. Why? Because all I
Right.
did was educate her. And I'm
Mm.
going to use FDA approved. I'm going to use proper materials to educate her. Okay.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
if you record me, fine. I don't care. You're not
Right.
going to find anything. Right.
Exactly. And meanwhile, we've seen the recordings inside of Planned Parenthood, which are just absolutely disturbing, to say the
Yeah.
least. And so that's what I love about this. This is based on truth. It's based on a holistic approach, holistic care. I think in terms of today, it's going to take more courage probably for people to continue to protest and continue to stand in this
Yeah.
gap for life. I think it's going to take maybe a little bit more courage because our government right now, I believe, in many different areas, not just
Yeah.
the area of life, is targeting Christian people, targeting people that stand for life, of course, to silence and intimidate and essentially end the opposition, aren't they? I mean, you put enough
They
people in
are.
jail, that gets your attention.
Yes, I'm sorry. Talk about perspective. Like if you ask our staff, I tell them all the time, oh, the difference between good and bad days is your perspective. They throw me in jail. People need saving there too, so it'll be okay.
Amazing. It's so good.
Look at the disciples. I think
Mm,
fundamentally it boils down to the believers. I'm back at the church and I'm
mm,
back to the word of truth, because at
yes.
the end of the day, if you look at true biblical discipleship, if you
Mm,
look at what really happens to those who follow Jesus, they
mm,
don't care. They don't
yeah.
care. I don't
Wow.
care. Not that I am reckless, but it's not
Yes.
going to change what they do. Doesn't change the truth. It doesn't change
Mm,
my calling. It doesn't change my
yes.
assignment. As
Mm,
a follower and believer of Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter. Whether we're
mm,
persecuted or whether we're celebrated, we are called to stand for life and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean,
amazing.
I know that sounds so simple,
Yeah.
but the consequences of also arriving at the truth, like how do you gain boldness? It's
Yes.
ultimately, like we talk about this all the time,
Mm,
this fight for abortion is like David and Goliath, but that's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
David still killed Goliath, right? At the
Yes.
end, like knowing, like this is not going to be by our might, our power. We already know it's a
Mm,
lopsided battle. If you look at, like you said, the
yeah.
political field, if you look at everything that's happening in the world, we've never been called to be in the world anyway. We have been
Yeah.
called to be set apart in the world, but
Yes.
not of the world. And we're going to do what we need to do because
Yeah.
lives are depending on it. Like one of the
Yeah.
most respectable things that I've learned for Dan Steiner is his commitment to the mission.
Mm,
And he just said, look,
yes.
the day and the hour this ship is created to save lives and save souls. The moment it stops becoming that, we'll find
Yes.
other jobs.
Yes. Yes.
So that's where we stand.
I want to bottle up your courage. Like I want to take this, I want to sell it. I want to give it away. But we need to reproduce this because you're right. Listen, if I go to prison, well, people need to be saved in prison too. You are so laser like focused, and I know this comes from Dan. You're so laser focused on the gospel, on evangelism, on discipleship, on the mission, the true mission,
Yeah.
that the consequences of standing for biblical truth and courage, the consequences don't really matter. And that's how you live with freedom and courage, isn't it?
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
man, going back to the truth of God's word.
Yeah.
You read the red letters of Jesus Christ, and you should be excited that the Lord in his divine wisdom appointed you to this day and this hour. Like the
Yes.
world, like in
Mm.
Romans, it says the world is eagerly groaning in eager expectation for the revelation of God's true sons and daughters. Like we
Yes.
should just not be afraid. We're not created with a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Like our
Yeah.
boldness doesn't come from our strength. It
Mm.
doesn't rest on that. It comes from the assurance that we serve a living God. Ultimately, do we believe this word freedom? It is for
Mm.
freedom that Christ Jesus has set us free. Do we
Yes.
ultimately believe, like we celebrated Easter, right?
Yes.
Do we ultimately believe the message that we profess?
Yes.
And is it worth dying for? Because
Mm.
genuinely, if you boil down the apologetics of all Christianity, the
Mm.
irrefutable fact, the undeniable apologetic of our faith is that he
Yes.
rose again, right? And those
Yes.
disciples, they will not
Mm.
die for a lie.
Right.
So it boils down to our individual walks with the Lord. Do we
Yes.
believe that Jesus is alive and he's worth dying for?
It's amazing.
And we need to get back to that truth.
Yes, we do. That is the foundational truth that gives courage to all believers, and I think, it's great because I look at the impact of preborn. I'm so glad we got introduced organizationally and personally because the impact is incredible. You talked about how many babies have been saved just last year, over 59,000, over 9,000 commitments to Christ. Over 72,000 abortion-minded women were served, and on it goes. I mean, you talk about training thousands in evangelism so that you can stay true to your mission. Tell us how to get involved. Tell our listeners, how do we engage with preborn to protect the unborn? How do we do it?
Yeah, very practically, if you want to help underwrite, sponsor an ultrasound, we just shared it. It's 100% goes to clinic, 100% tax deductible, right? So $28 helps underwrite an ultrasound session. That's one session.
Mm,
$28 monthly goes a long way to help us like offer all these services. Preborn offers all its services free to the clinic and
mm,
free to the woman.
amazing.
Second, if you're here and you're listening, you have capacity, you want to place a brand new ultrasound machine, there's an opportunity. You can place a brand new ultrasound machine at a clinic
Mm,
where it's needed the most for $15,000.
great.
And we'll place it in our target areas with, we just talked about how we select and how we think
Yes.
through every decision that we have.
Mm,
And really those two things are a get entry point financially.
mm,
Second is prayer. We could
yes.
always use prayer. This battle is not against flesh and blood. So if you're interested, email info@preborn.com.
Mm,
And the same with churches. If you want to engage with your church, whether you're a pastor or you have influence over the decision makers of your church, there's a lot of
mm,
things that we can do. And if you
yes.
are looking for a career in the ministry of life, this is my shameless
Mm,
plug. We want bold
yes.
people that loves the Lord, loves the
Mm,
gospel, loves life. Visit preborn.org. We have a lot of
mm,
positions up and we'd love to talk to you about it. I mean,
mm.
it's all hands on deck.
Yes, it is. And there hasn't been a more important time in our history than right now. And hey, Roxy, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the boldness, your commitment to Christ, and to really making a difference. So thankful for the ways that our listeners can get involved. We're going to promote the heck out of this because we believe in what you're doing. So God bless you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for our time.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.